My name is Waylon Jeffries, and I survived 90 days alone on an oil rig during the zombie apocalypse. What started as a normal Tuesday shift became a nightmare when the mainland fell. I watched my 62 crewmates turn or die. Then Hurricane Eleanor hit, destroying half our platform but giving me one chance at escape. This is how engineering skills kept me alive when everyone else perished. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section. Below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Waylon Jeffries. For 90 days, I was the only living human on the Poseidon's Reach oil platform, 120 miles off the Louisiana coast. This is how I survived. Before all this, I spent 12 years in the Navy as a mechanical engineer on nuclear submarines. After getting out, I worked the last decade on deep-sea oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. My specialty was underwater repairs and maintaining electrical systems. I could fix just about anything that broke down there. Turns out those skills matter a lot when civilization collapses. Poseidon's Reach was one of the largest drilling operations in the Gulf. Imagine a massive metal island rising from the sea, with 4 levels of living quarters, operations centers, and drilling equipment. We had a crew of 62 men and women who lived and worked in shifts. Most people can't handle the isolation of rig life, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, but I preferred it to being on land. There's a simplicity to it. Everything has a purpose, everyone has a job. Life on the rig before everything happened was monotonous in the best way. Wake up, eat breakfast with the same people, check systems, perform maintenance, play cards after dinner. Torres, my best friend from Navy days, worked communications. Patel was our medical officer. Johnson ran the drilling team. Martinez handled the kitchen. We weren't just colleagues. After years together, we were family. The first signs that something was wrong came in early September. We noticed increased Coast Guard activity in the Gulf, more patrols than usual passing near our location. The supply helicopters that came twice weekly brought crew members who mentioned military checkpoints at the heliport in Gulfport. Strange. Reports about civil unrest in coastal cities. Nothing specific, just rumors. At the same time, the weather station kept sending warnings about Hurricane Eleanor forming in the Atlantic. It was still weeks away, but the meteorologists were already concerned about its size and trajectory. I remember thinking we might get evacuated early for the storm. I had no idea that hurricane would eventually save my life. Most of us dismissed the mainland reports as exaggerated. Oil rig workers love to gossip. Every minor incident becomes a catastrophe in the retelling. But I noticed our radio operator, Harkins, looking increasingly worried after communications with shore. He wouldn't say much, just that things were tense back home. Then came September 14th. A Tuesday. I was midway through my shift working on a faulty generator in the lower level when the emergency broadcast system activated throughout the rig. Not a drill. Harkins' voice came over the speakers, calling all supervisors to the communications room immediately. The rest of us were told to continue working but remain alert. I shouldn't have been in that meeting. I wasn't a supervisor. But I needed to ask Martinez something about the generator, and he'd been called up, so I went. That's how I became one of the first people on the rig to hear what was happening. Harkins was pale, sweating, as he played back the transmissions he'd been receiving. Fragmented emergency calls from Gulfport Mobile, Biloxi, people screaming. Official-sounding voices using words like containment and infection rate and shoot on sight. One Coast Guard transmission stated clearly, all Gulf platforms advised to initiate lockdown protocols. No personnel to leave or board until further notice. Our operations manager, Davidson, immediately started talking about maintaining normal functions while monitoring the situation. I remember checking our evacuation boats that night, something I'd never done before. Like some part of me already knew we'd need them. Over the next 48 hours, we watched the lights of coastal cities go dark one by one. From our position, on a clear night, you could see the illumination of Biloxi, Gulfport, and sometimes even the glow of New Orleans. First Gulfport disappeared, then Mobile. By the second night, the entire coastline was black. Regular communication, channels failed. TV signals cut out. Internet connection became spotty, then non-existent. The final directive from the company came through at 4 in the morning. Maintain operations, no shore leaves, await further instructions. There were no further instructions. The crew split into factions. Some believed it was a temporary situation, a power grid failure, maybe, or some kind of cyber attack. Others, including me, sensed something far worse. We started inventorying supplies, calculating how long we could last isolated. On the third day, our scheduled supply helicopter approached but refused to land. The pilot hovered above the helipad, dropped several packages, and immediately turned back toward shore. Through the radio, he shouted something about quarantine before flying away. That was the last helicopter we ever saw. The packages contained medical supplies, some additional food, and a sealed letter for Davidson. I never saw that letter, but after reading it, Davidson locked himself in his quarters for 6 hours. When he emerged, he called a meeting and told us we were on our own indefinitely. On day 4, the first boats appeared on the horizon. Small vessels packed with people heading directly for our platform. Through binoculars, we could see they were civilians, families, some injured, all looking desperate. The captain called a meeting to decide whether to allow them aboard. I argued against it, strongly. We had no idea what was happening on the mainland, what these people might be carrying, or if they posed a threat. We had limited supplies already, but I was outvoted. Most of the crew couldn't stomach the idea of turning away people in distress, especially families with children. "We're not animals," Davidson said. "We help them until proper authorities arrive." The proper authorities never arrived. I was assigned to the receiving team on the lower dock. 3 boats reached us that afternoon carrying 27 refugees total, men, women, children, all terrified, some injured. They spoke of chaos on shore, people attacking each other in the streets, neighbors turning violent without warning, government collapse. One man on the 3rd boat caught my attention immediately. Even from a distance, I could see he was sweating profusely despite the cool evening air. His movements were strange, jerky. I should have said something, reported my concerns to Davidson or Patel. But the situation was already tense. I didn't want to appear paranoid. That was my first mistake, a mistake that cost 54 lives. The refugees were processed in the mess hall. They were given food, water, medical attention. Patel, our medical officer, examined the sick-looking man, diagnosed him with extreme dehydration and possible shock, put him on IV fluids. For a few hours, everything seemed under control. During dinner, with most of the crew and refugees gathered in the mess hall, the man began seizing. Patel rushed to help. I was across the room watching. I'll never forget what happened next. The man lunged forward, sank his teeth into Patel's neck, and tore out his throat. Not like a human bite, like an animal. The room erupted in screams. 2 crew members tried to pull him off, and he attacked them too. Within minutes, Patel and those crew members began exhibiting the same symptoms: seizures, aggression, inhuman strength. It spread through the crowded mess hall like wildfire. People running, screaming, being tackled and bitten. I was near an exit and managed to escape with 4 other crew members. We sealed the doors, but it was already too late. Some of the refugees who had seemed fine were already infected, already changing in other parts of the rig. By midnight, the Poseidon's Reach had become a slaughterhouse. Survivors clustered in different sections using radios to communicate. My group made it to the engineering level, where we had tools, access to some food storage, and heavy doors we could secure. 7 of us total. Me, Torres from communications, Chen and Williams from electrical, Romano from drilling, and 2 refugees, a woman named Sophia and her teenage son Eli. We established a system, barricaded the main access points, set up sleeping rotations so someone was always on watch, rationed the food we'd managed to grab. For that first week, we survived on hope as much as supplies. Torres kept saying help would come once the authorities contained whatever was happening on shore. Torres talked a lot about his kids in Biloxi, a boy and a girl, 10 and 8. Showed us their photo constantly. Said once things calmed down, we'd all find a way back to shore. I couldn't tell him what I really thought had happened to the coastal cities. None of us could. On day 8, we lost contact with the group barricaded in the upper deck living quarters. 12 people, including Davidson. Their radio just went silent mid-transmission. Torres, Romano, and I volunteered to check on them, leaving the others secured in our section. We moved carefully through the maintenance corridors, armed with pipe wrenches and cutting tools. When we reached the living quarters, we found the barricades torn apart from the inside, blood everywhere, and the infected, our former colleagues, people we'd worked with for years, wandering aimlessly, still in their uniforms, but now moving with that same jerky motion, eyes vacant. We tried to retreat silently, but Romano knocked over a fire extinguisher. The sound alerted them. They came at us fast, much faster than a human should move. Torres and I made it back to the door. Romano didn't. We had to close it with him on the other side, his screams following us all the way back to our sanctuary. When we returned without Romano, our group's morale collapsed. Sophia wouldn't stop crying. Eli stared blankly at the wall. Shen and Williams argued about whether we should try to reach the evacuation boats. Torres just kept looking at his kid's photo. What none of us knew then was that the infected were figuring out how to climb ladders, open simple latches. They weren't mindless. There was some terrible intelligence still working in there, and they were hungry. That night, through the maintenance shaft beneath our position, we heard them coming. 2 weeks in, we were down to 5 people. Chen didn't make it when they came through the maintenance shaft. Williams was bitten trying to help him and chose to lock himself in a supply closet, rather than turn while with us. That kind of courage became rare. Our remaining group, me, Torres, Sophia, and Eli, retreated deeper into the engineering section. We had lost our main stockpile of food during the attack, escaping with only what we could carry. Torres managed to grab the emergency radio, which became our lifeline to the outside world. Not that anyone was broadcasting much by then. We tried reaching other survivor groups on the rig using handheld radios. For a few days, we maintained contact with a group of 4 in the control room, and another group of 3 who had barricaded themselves in the crane operator's cabin. Then the control room went silent. The crane group lasted another 2 days before their transmissions stopped mid-sentence. Torres kept trying different frequencies, hoping to reach the mainland or passing ships. Occasionally, we'd pick up fragments, military channels using code words, brief transmissions between survivor groups on land. Nothing consistent, nothing helpful. They have to be organizing somewhere, Torres would say, adjusting the dial. For hours. The government, military, someone must be fighting back. I didn't have the heart to tell him what I suspected, that whatever had happened had been too fast, too overwhelming for any organized response. We established a new safe room in what had been a pressure testing chamber, solid walls, 1 reinforced door, no windows. From there, we made careful expeditions for supplies. Water was our biggest concern. The rig's freshwater system relied on pumps that required regular maintenance. Without it, the supply would eventually become contaminated. I rigged a system to collect rainwater using tarps and empty containers. Gulf storms provided enough to keep us hydrated, if not comfortable. Food was trickier. We rationed carefully, but it was clear we wouldn't last more than a few more weeks. During one supply run, I discovered something alarming. The infected were changing, adapting. Early on, they'd wander aimlessly until stimulated by sound or movement. Now they seemed to patrol, almost as if searching, and they were figuring out tools. I watched one use a wrench to pry open a door that had been jammed shut. That's when I knew we couldn't stay put indefinitely. On day 15, we lost communication with the other platforms in our drilling network. Before that, we'd had sporadic radio contact with Poseidon's sister, a similar rig about 40 miles east. Their situation had mirrored ours. Initial outbreak, survivors clustered indefensible, locations dwindling supplies. Their last transmission was just 3 words: they're breaking through. That night, Torres and I stayed up late discussing options. The evacuation boats were our only real chance, but they were on the other side of the rig, past dozens of infected, including some of our friends. We need a diversion, Torres said, something to draw them away from the path to the boats. He had this theory that the rig's firefighting systems might slow them down. Salt water at high pressure wouldn't kill them, obviously, but it might disorient them, maybe even wash some off the platform. We never got to test his theory. The next morning, Sophia woke with a fever. She'd hidden a cut on her arm from an earlier supply run, not wanting to worry us. By noon, she was delirious. By evening, her eyes had developed that vacant look we'd come to recognize. Eli refused to leave his mother's side, despite our warnings. Torres had to physically drag him to the other side of our safe room when Sophia began convulsing. I was the one who restrained her using cable ties we'd collected. I was the one who got her secured to a pipe just before she would have bitten her own son. We couldn't bring ourselves to kill her, not when she was still wearing Sophia's face, still in Sophia's clothes. So we left her there, secured, and moved to our fallback position, a smaller maintenance room nearby. We could hear her throwing herself against the restraints all night, the metal creaking with each impact. Eli didn't speak for days after that, just stared at, nothing, barely eating or drinking. Torres tried to keep his spirits up, telling stories about his kids, promising we'd all make it to safety. I focused on practical matters, finding supplies, securing our position, planning our next move. That's when our luck ran out entirely. While returning from a supply run, I heard unfamiliar voices in a corridor that should have been empty. Not the guttural sounds of the infected, but actual conversation. I hid and watched as 3 men in ragged civilian clothes made their way through our section. Looters, other survivors who had somehow reached the rig and were scavenging what they could. I followed them at a distance, hoping to make contact, possibly form an alliance. Then I saw one of them shoot a padlock rather than trying to pick it. The sound echoed throughout the metal corridors of the rig. Within minutes, the infected were converging on their position. The men fired their weapons, creating even more noise, drawing even more attention. It was a slaughter. But in their panic, they also led the horde directly back toward our hiding place. I ran ahead, warning Torres and Eli. We had minutes at most before our position would be overrun. Torres immediately started gathering essential supplies: water, the radio, his kid's photo. Eli seemed to snap out of his daze, helping me secure the exit route I'd identified days earlier, a maintenance tunnel that led to the lower deck. We could hear them coming, dozens of footsteps, that distinctive shuffling gait, the metal walkways vibrating with their approach. We had one chance, a narrow access shaft that only one person at a time could navigate. Torres looked at me, then at Eli. "You take him," he said, handing me his kid's photo. "Get to the boats. Find my family if you can." I argued, but Torres had already made his decision. He would hold the main door, buy us time to escape. Before closing the hatch, behind us, he made me promise to get back to shore someday. Said his kids needed to know what happened to their dad. At the time, I just nodded, knowing it was impossible, but that promise would keep me going in the darkest moments ahead. The last I saw of Torres, he was wedging a metal bar across the door, radio in hand, planning to use it to draw the infected away from our escape route. Eli and I crawled through the access shaft as the sound of pounding on metal echoed behind us. We made it to the lower deck, but our path to the evacuation boats was cut off, infected everywhere, drawn by the noise from above. We retreated to a storage room, waited for hours, listening. When we tried again after nightfall, we found more infected had arrived, including some wearing the clothes of the looters who had doomed us. For 3 days, Eli and I moved from hiding place to hiding place, trying to find a clear path to the boats. We slept in shifts, rationed our dwindling supplies, spoke in whispers. The boy was holding up remarkably well given everything he'd witnessed, until he saw his mother. We were crossing a catwalk when Sophia appeared below us. Still secured by one wrist with the cable tie, she'd torn herself free of the pipe, dislocating her shoulder in the process. Her arm hung at an impossible angle, but she showed no sign of pain, just that terrible, vacant hunger. Eli froze, called out to her. The sound drew her attention and others nearby. I pulled him back just as they began climbing toward our position. We ran, but in his emotional state, Eli wasn't watching his footing. He stumbled, fell behind. I reached back for him, but a section of the catwalk collapsed between us. Industrial platforms like Poseidon's Reach require constant maintenance. After weeks of neglect, its infrastructure was failing. I watched helplessly as the infected surrounded Eli, heard his screams, then silence. I was alone. The first days of solitude were the hardest, the crushing weight of grief and failure. All those lives lost. Torres, Sophia, Eli, everyone. I considered ending it. One quick step off the platform edge and into the gulf below. What was the point of continuing? But something in me refused to give up. Maybe it was Torres's final request. Maybe just survival instinct. I decided if I was going to die, it wouldn't be by my own hand. And if I was going to live, I needed a system. I started by identifying secure locations across the rig. Maintenance closets, storage rooms, equipment housings with access hatches too small for multiple infected to enter at once. I created a mental map of safe pathways between them, using the service ducts and crawl spaces that only maintenance personnel like me knew existed. Each day followed the same pattern. Move at first light when the infected seemed most sluggish. Gather what supplies I could find. Return to that day's hiding spot before dusk when they became more active. I kept moving, never staying in one location more than a single night. Water collection became my primary focus. I expanded my rainwater harvesting system, setting up collection points across the platform that I could check during my daily movements. Food was more challenging. The mess hall and main storage areas were completely overrun. I survived on emergency rations found in lifeboats, forgotten lunchboxes, and personal stashes in crew quarters I could safely access. I developed a system for moving silently across metal walkways that would normally ring with every footstep. Wrapping cloth around boots, testing each step, freezing in place at the slightest sound of movement nearby. I learned to distinguish between the infected and the normal creaks and groans of the platform itself. My primary weapon became a modified hydraulic wrench, heavy enough to crush a skull if necessary, useful as a tool for my daily survival needs. I adapted other engineering tools as weapons or for creating defensive barriers, welding equipment to seal doors, pipe cutters to breach walls when needed. I started marking days on the wall of my main hiding spot, a ventilation control room that the infected seemed to avoid, perhaps due to the constant white noise of the fans. Watching hurricane season approach on the calendar made my stomach knot. The rig was barely holding together with normal maintenance. What would happen when the big storms came? At night, when moving was too dangerous, I'd record observations in a notebook I'd found. The infected seemed disoriented during heavy rainstorms. The noise, maybe, or the changing air pressure. I documented everything, not realizing how crucial that observation would become. Some nights I'd climb to the helipad, the one place they rarely went, and look at the stars. I'd imagine I could see lights of ships, other rigs, anything. But there was only darkness across the gulf, and I'd wonder, am I the last person alive? After about a month alone, something changed in me. The fear receded, replaced by a mechanical determination. Each day was a problem to solve, each encounter with the infected a puzzle rather than a terror. I stopped seeing them as former friends and colleagues. They were just obstacles now. I became methodical, emotionless, surviving rather than living. I talked to myself constantly, just to hear a human voice. Had imaginary conversations with Torres, with my grandmother who raised me, with crew members long gone. I assigned personalities to inanimate objects, a particular pipe wrench I named Betsy, a radio that never worked that I called Liar. I developed rituals and superstitions, never start a journey with my right foot, always tap a door 3 times before opening it. Madness, probably, but it kept me sane. Sleep came in 2-hour bursts. I trained myself to wake at the slightest sound. I don't think I dreamed anymore. Or if I did, the nightmares were indistinguishable from waking reality. Through it all, I kept moving, kept adapting. I became something else on that rig. Not fully human anymore, but not like them either. Just a machine designed for one purpose: persistence. By day 50, I had mapped every safe zone on what remained of the platform, had created hidden caches of supplies that would last weeks if necessary, had developed a sixth sense for detecting the infected before seeing them, had survived dozens of close encounters that should have been the end of me. Then I heard the weather report on the emergency radio I'd salvaged. Hurricane Eleanor had strengthened to a Category 4 and was heading directly for our position in the Gulf. The radio announcement about Hurricane Eleanor didn't surprise me. I'd been tracking the storm system for days on the barometer I'd salvaged from the meteorological station. The needle had been dropping steadily, faster than I'd ever seen during my years on Gulf platforms. But hearing the automated emergency broadcast confirm it was now a Category 4 heading directly for our position made my stomach tighten. Under normal circumstances, a storm of that magnitude would trigger an immediate evacuation. All personnel would be helicoptered to shore. The IA rig would be secured by a skeleton crew. Then they'd evacuate too. Critical systems would be shut down. Drilling operations suspended, everything battened down. But there was just me now. I had about 36 hours before the storm would hit us. I needed to choose where to shelter, then prepare that location to withstand what was coming. I considered the living quarters, but they were heavily infested with the infected. The control room was centrally located but had too many windows. The drilling floor was too exposed. In the end, I chose a maintenance closet on the second level, just below the main deck. It was small, barely 6 feet by 8 feet, but had several advantages. Solid, steel walls, no windows, a heavy door that locked from the inside. It was near the center of the rig's structure, which would provide some protection from the worst winds, and it had a small ventilation shaft I could escape through if necessary. I spent the next day gathering supplies and securing them in my chosen shelter. Water for several days, the remaining emergency rations, my tools, first aid kit, the emergency radio, flashlights and batteries. Everything I might need if the storm damaged the platform so badly I couldn't leave the closet for days. While preparing, I noticed increased activity among the infected. They seemed agitated, moving more quickly, vocalizing more. The changing air pressure before the storm was affecting them somehow. I used their distraction to move more freely across the rig than I normally would have risked, collecting last-minute supplies. By evening, the sea was already churning, waves slapping higher against the platform legs than I'd ever seen. The wind was picking up, a constant howl through the rig's exposed structures. Dark clouds had swallowed the horizon. I made one final trip to the helipad, looking out at the approaching wall of black. Then I retreated to my shelter. I secured myself inside the maintenance closet, using carabiners and sturdy straps to create a harness that anchored me to a heavy pipe running along the wall. If the rig capsized, I wanted at least a chance of staying with a floating section rather than being thrown into the sea. I positioned my supplies so they wouldn't become projectiles in high winds. Then I settled into wait. The barometer was dropping faster than I'd ever seen. The meteorologist said Eleanor might reach Category 5. No oil rig is built to withstand that, not intact anyway. I found myself wondering if this was finally it, not taken by the infected but by nature itself. There would be a certain poetry in that. The storm hit with full force around midnight. First came the rain, hammering the metal exterior of the rig like millions of tiny bullets. Then the wind, not blowing but pushing, a solid force that made the entire platform sway. I could feel the motion even in my sheltered location. The sound was indescribable. Metal groaning, wind shrieking through every opening, waves crashing against the platform legs far below. And underneath it all, something else. The infected, driven into a frenzy by the storm, their collective howls rising and falling with the wind. 2 hours in, I heard the first major structural failure. A deep resonant boom that shook the entire rig, followed by the screech of tearing metal. Something major had broken away. Part of the derrick, maybe, or one of the outer walkways. I tightened my harness and braced myself. More failures followed. The platform was coming apart piece by piece. Water began seeping under the door of my shelter as rain found new paths through the damaged structure above. I used my emergency light sparingly, knowing the batteries might need to last days. During those hours, strapped into that closet, I made peace with dying. I thought about Torres, about my grandmother, about all the people I'd lost. I wasn't afraid anymore, and somehow that's when I knew I would survive. Around 4 a.m, the wind suddenly died. The eye of the hurricane had reached us. The platform stopped swaying so violently. The constant barrage of sound dropped to an eerie quiet, broken only by the dripping of water and the settling of damaged metal. I knew we had perhaps 30 minutes before the back wall of the storm would hit us, even stronger than the front. I debated whether to use this opportunity to move to a different location, maybe assess the damage. In the end, I decided to stay put. The structural integrity of the rig was compromised. Moving around could be suicidal. When the second half of the hurricane hit, it was worse than the first. The wind came from the opposite direction, stressing already damaged sections in new ways. The swaying of the platform became extreme, like being on a ship in heavy seas rather than a fixed structure. I could hear large sections breaking away, crashing into the Gulf. Water began pouring in through the ceiling of my shelter as something above gave way. I pulled a tarp over myself and my supplies, shivering as the cold seawater soaked through my clothes. The temperature dropped. My light flickered and died. I sat in absolute darkness, feeling the platform disintegrating around me. The storm raged for 9 hours total. When it finally began to subside, I remained in my shelter, unsure if it was truly over or just another lull. Only when daylight began filtering through the cracks in the ceiling did I dare to unfasten my harness and try the door. It wouldn't open. Something outside was blocking it. I had to use my ventilation shaft escape route, wriggling through the narrow space until I emerged in a corridor I barely recognized. Half the ceiling was gone. Seawater pooled on the floor, debris everywhere. I made my way carefully to the upper deck, stepping over fallen beams and shattered equipment. The scene that greeted me there stopped me cold. Half of Poseidon's Reach was simply gone. The entire eastern section of the platform, including the living quarters, mess hall, and control room, had been torn away. What remained was a jagged half-circle of twisted metal emerging from the sea. But the most shocking thing was the silence. No shuffling movement, no guttural moans. The infected were gone, either washed away by the storm surge or thrown into the Gulf when their sections collapsed. For the first time in months, I could move freely. I spent that first day assessing the damage and searching for any infected that might have survived. Found none. The storm had cleared the rig more effectively than any human effort could have. It had also destroyed most of my carefully placed supply caches and water collection systems. What remained of the platform was dangerously unstable. Several of the main support columns were visibly damaged. The whole structure shuddered with each sizable wave. It wouldn't survive another storm, maybe not even another week. Standing on what remained of the helipad, I could see for miles in the clear post-storm air. That's when I noticed something on the horizon that hadn't been there before, something that would change everything. A boat. Not just any boat, but a Coast Guard cutter, drifting about 2 miles from the platform. Through my binoculars, I could see it was damaged but intact. No movement on deck, no signs of the infected. And it appeared to be caught on something, preventing it from drifting farther away. I watched it for hours, confirming it was truly empty. It must have broken free from its moorings during the storm and drifted out to sea. By some miracle, it had ended up near my position. My first thought was that it might have working communications equipment. My second was that it represented my only chance of leaving the rig. The question was how to reach it. The platform's crane was gone, along with all the small craft we'd used for transfers and maintenance. The lifeboats had either been taken by the first evacuees or washed away in the storm. Swimming was possible. I'd been a strong swimmer since childhood. But 2 miles in open Gulf waters with potential debris was extremely risky. I spent the next day searching the remains of the platform for anything that could help me reach the boat. The storm had scattered equipment everywhere, much of it damaged beyond use. But I managed to salvage several empty fuel drums, some lengths of rope, and various pieces of debris that could float. My plan was to construct a crude raft, not to ride all the way to the cutter, but to get me far enough away from the platform's dangerous underwater debris field. From there, I would swim, pushing the raft ahead of me for support if needed. As I worked on my raft, I noticed the Coast Guard vessel was gradually drifting closer. Whatever had been holding it in place was giving way. This both encouraged and worried me. If it drifted near enough, my journey would be easier. But if it drifted past without me reaching it, I'd lose my only chance at escape. By the next morning, the cutter had moved to within a mile of the platform, close enough that I could now see details: a damaged radar array, a partially collapsed mast but an otherwise intact hull. I decided it was time to make my attempt. I finished my makeshift raft, 4 empty drums lashed together with rope, with a small platform of debris on top where I could secure my few remaining supplies. I planned my departure for midday when visibility would be best. As I prepared to leave, I felt a strange reluctance. This broken platform had been my home, my prison, and ultimately my sanctuary for over 60 days. Despite everything I had survived here, the mainland represented an unknown. What if the entire country, the entire world, was like what we'd glimpsed before losing contact? What if I was safer here in my isolation? But I thought of Torres, of the promise I'd made. His kid's photo was still in my pocket, protected in a waterproof bag. And I thought of my own future. How long could I really survive on this failing structure? Days, maybe weeks before it collapsed entirely, or I ran out of drinkable water. I had gathered the few supplies I could carry in a waterproof pack: my tools, the emergency radio, my notebook of observations, a first aid kit, my remaining food and water. I secured them to the raft with my remaining rope. Then I dragged the whole assembly to the lowest intact deck where I could safely enter the water. The Gulf was still choppy from the hurricane's passage, but the sun was shining, and visibility was excellent. I could clearly see my target. I took a deep breath, pushed my raft into the water, and followed it in. The water was warmer than I expected, almost pleasant after months of irregular cold showers on the rig. I guided my raft away from the platform, careful to avoid the underwater debris field. Metal from the collapsed sections could easily tear my improvised flotation devices or, worse, tear into me. Once, clear of the immediate danger zone, I began swimming toward the Coast Guard cutter, pushing the raft ahead of me. The current was working in my favor, carrying me generally in the right direction, though I had to correct course frequently. After about 20 minutes of steady swimming, I allowed myself to look back at Poseidon's Reach. From this distance, the devastation was even more apparent. What had once been a massive industrial complex now looked like a broken toy discarded in a bathtub. Hard to believe 62 people had once lived and worked there. Hard to believe I had survived there alone for so long. I turned back toward my goal and continued swimming. The raft proved invaluable, allowing me to rest periodically without losing progress to the current. Still, the journey was exhausting. The distance that had seemed manageable from the platform stretched endlessly before me in the water. After nearly 2 hours of swimming, I finally reached the Coast Guard cutter. Up close, it was larger than it had appeared through binoculars, its white hull rising steeply from the water. I circled it once, looking for the easiest way aboard. Found a rope ladder hanging over the port side, partially submerged but still usable. Securing my raft to the ladder, I began to climb, my muscles protesting after the long swim. When I finally hauled myself over the railing and onto the deck, I collapsed, breathing heavily, the sun warm on my face. I had made it. But had I escaped one danger only to find another? After catching my breath, I rose cautiously and began to explore the vessel. It was a medium-sized patrol boat, designed for coastal operations rather than deep sea. The bridge was intact, though some of the electronics had been damaged by water. I moved methodically through the ship, checking each compartment, ready to retreat if I encountered any infected. But the vessel was empty. Evidence suggested it had been abandoned in haste, personal items left behind, a meal half-eaten in the galley. No signs of violence or struggle. Perhaps the crew had evacuated to land when the outbreak began, or been ordered to other duties. In the crew quarters, I found clean, dry clothes to replace my salt-soaked garments. In the galley, canned, food and bottled water. In the captain's cabin, charts of the Gulf Coast and a logbook with entries ending abruptly 3 months earlier. The engine room became my primary focus. If the engines were operational, I could potentially reach land within hours rather than days. I spent the remainder of that day examining the diesel engines, checking fuel levels, and assessing what repairs might be needed. The main engine had suffered some damage, likely from debris during the storm, but my years of mechanical experience on submarines and oil rigs made the problem seem manageable. With the right tools and parts, I could get this vessel moving again. As the sun set on my first day aboard the cutter, I secured myself in the captain's cabin, enjoying the luxury of a real bed after months of sleeping on metal floors and in maintenance closets. Through the cabin window, I could see the remains of Poseidon's Reach silhouetted against the darkening sky. From this distance, with the platform's running lights long dead, it looked like a jagged black island rising from the sea. Tomorrow, I would begin repairs on the engine. I would check the communications equipment, though I had little hope of contacting anyone. And I would make a decision about where to go if I succeeded in getting the boat operational. The nearest land was the Louisiana coast, but was that still the best option? As I drifted toward sleep, more comfortable than I had been in months, I realized something had changed within me. For the first time since the outbreak, I was thinking about the future as something more than just surviving another day. I was making plans, setting goals. I still had no idea what awaited me on the mainland, whether human civilization still existed in any recognizable form, whether I would find others like me, survivors trying to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. I spent 3 days on the Coast Guard cutter before attempting to start the engines. Those first days were about careful assessment, taking inventory and making necessary repairs. The vessel, which I learned from documentation was named the USCGC Steadfast, had suffered damage during Hurricane Eleanor, but nothing catastrophic. The main engine had a damaged cooling system and several electrical connections that had corroded from saltwater exposure. Fortunately, the parts I needed were available in the ship's maintenance supplies, or could be improvised from other systems. My years working with submarines in the Navy and maintaining complex machinery on oil rigs made these repairs challenging but not impossible. While working on the engine, I also explored the ship thoroughly. The Steadfast was a medium-endurance cutter, about 210 feet long, designed for extended patrols. It normally carried a crew of around 75, so the empty vessel felt eerily spacious after months of hiding in maintenance closets. The communications room became a particular focus. If I could establish contact with other survivors before setting course for the mainland, I might avoid sailing directly into danger. The main radio systems were damaged beyond my ability to repair, but I found a backup emergency transmitter that still functioned. I set it to broadcast on standard emergency frequencies and recorded a simple message identifying myself and my position, repeating every hour. For 3 days, I monitored all frequencies, hoping for a response. None came. I heard occasional fragments, brief transmissions cut off mid-sentence, automated emergency broadcasts, once what sounded like a military communication using codes I didn't recognize. Nothing directed at me. Nothing I could use to determine a safe destination. Without guidance, I had to make my own decision about where to go. The ship's charts gave me options. The Louisiana coast was closest, less than a day's journey with functioning engines. But coastal areas had been the first to fall. Moving inland would mean abandoning the relative safety of the vessel. Florida was another possibility with its numerous isolated keys and islands. Or I could attempt to reach Mexico or Cuba, though fuel might become an issue for such an extended journey. In the end, I decided on a compromise. I would head toward the Mississippi coast but not make landfall immediately. Instead, I would approach close enough to observe conditions through binoculars, looking for signs of survivors or danger. The ship could serve as my mobile base while I scouted potential landing sites. On the morning of my fourth day aboard, I completed the final repairs to the engine and prepared to depart. Before starting the engines, I took one last look at Poseidon's reach. The platform had deteriorated further since I'd left it. Several more sections had collapsed into the sea. It listed noticeably to one side, its remaining support legs likely undermined by the hurricane. It wouldn't be standing much longer. I felt an unexpected wave of emotion watching my home of the past 3 months slowly dying. Despite everything that had happened there, despite the horrors I'd witnessed, that platform had kept me alive when the rest of the world seemed to be falling apart. I took a moment to silently thank it, then turned my attention to the controls of the Steadfast. The engine started on the third attempt, a deep mechanical rumble that vibrated through the entire vessel. I had to make several adjustments to the throttle and cooling systems, but eventually achieved a stable idle. After months of the relative silence of the abandoned rig, broken only by the sounds of the infected and the sea, the engine's noise was almost overwhelming. I set course for the Mississippi coast, about 100 miles to the northwest. At the reduced speed I was maintaining to avoid stressing the repaired engine, the journey would take approximately 12 hours. That would put me within sight of land by sunset. As the Steadfast pulled away from the oil platform, I felt both excitement and apprehension. I was leaving relative safety for unknown dangers, but I was also taking action after months of merely reacting, merely surviving. There was power in that choice. The day passed uneventfully as I guided the vessel northwest. I maintained watch for other ships but saw none. The Gulf was empty, the shipping lanes that had once been busy with tankers, cargo vessels, and fishing, boats now abandoned. I kept the emergency radio broadcasting my position and monitored all frequencies but heard nothing directed at me. Around mid-afternoon I spotted something in the water ahead, floating debris, a lot of it. As I drew closer I realized I was seeing the remnants of boats, dozens of them. Small pleasure craft, fishing vessels, even a few larger yachts. All damaged, many partially submerged, evidence of people who had tried to escape whatever was happening on land by taking to the water. I navigated carefully through this floating graveyard, watching for survivors, though I knew the chances were slim after so much time. Found none. Some of the boats showed signs of violence, bullet holes, bloodstains. Others appeared to have simply been abandoned or fallen victim to storms or lack of maintenance. As sunset approached, I caught my first glimpse of the Mississippi coastline. Through binoculars, I could see the familiar shape of the shore, but nothing looked as it should. Biloxi, which should have been visible as a cluster of hotels and casinos along the shore, was dark. No lights. Several of the taller buildings appeared to have burned. Smoke still rose from scattered locations along the coast. I dropped anchor about 2 miles offshore, not willing to approach closer in the failing light. From this distance, I could see no movement on land, no signs of human activity. But that didn't mean no one was there. Or nothing. I spent that night on high alert, maintaining watch from the bridge with the ship's lights off. Used night vision, binoculars salvaged from the ship's equipment stores to scan the shoreline periodically. Occasionally I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting between buildings or along the beach, but nothing definitive. At dawn, I raised anchor and cautiously moved the Steadfast closer to shore, maintaining enough distance to retreat quickly if necessary. In the clear morning light, the devastation was more apparent. Boats had been driven up onto beaches by storms. Buildings were damaged, many burned out. Roads were cluttered with abandoned vehicles. Still, I saw no clear evidence of the infected or survivors. The city seemed completely abandoned. This matched with what we'd heard in those early days on the rig. Coastal populations had either evacuated inland, been infected, or perished. I spent the entire day moving slowly along the coastline, from Biloxi toward Gulfport, observing through binoculars. The pattern was consistent: destruction, abandonment, silence. By evening, I had to make a decision. Continuing to burn fuel, without a clear destination, wasn't sustainable. I needed to either risk going ashore or choose another course. That's when I picked up the first clear transmission I'd heard in days. A voice, breaking through static on one of the emergency frequencies. I'd been monitoring, To all survivors in the Gulf region, safe zone established in the Appalachian Mountains, medical aid, food, shelter available, broadcasting coordinates. What followed was a series of numbers, latitude and longitude for a location in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, about 400 miles inland from my current position. The message repeated 3 times, then ended. I tried responding, identifying myself and requesting additional information, but received no reply. It could have been an automated message, recorded and set to broadcast periodically. It could have been a trap. But it was the first concrete information about a potential safe haven I'd received since the outbreak began. I consulted the ship's charts. There was no way to get the Steadfast anywhere near the coordinates. I would need to go ashore and find alternate transportation. The prospect terrified me after months of relative safety at sea. But what choice did I have? Remain on the ship until fuel or supplies ran out? I decided to make landfall the next morning at a small marina I'd observed during my coastal survey. It appeared relatively intact and was separated from the main urban areas where infected would likely be concentrated. That night, I prepared methodically for what might be my final hours aboard the Steadfast. I gathered all useful supplies into a backpack: food, water, first aid kit, tools, maps, compass, the emergency radio, batteries, Torres's photo of his children. I selected weapons from the ship's limited armory: a combat knife, a flare gun that could serve as a last resort defense. I dressed in layers, anticipating varied conditions during inland travel. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night making mental preparations, reviewing everything I'd learned about the infected during my time on the rig. Their behavior patterns, their weaknesses, how to move without attracting their attention. I reminded myself that I had survived alone for months in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. I could survive this too. At first light, I guided the Steadfast toward the marina I'd selected. As I approached, I cut the engines and used the ship's small inflatable tender to cover the final distance to shore. Better to arrive quietly. The infected were attracted to sound. Reaching the dock sent a shock through my system. Solid ground beneath my feet for the first time in months. The world seemed to sway, my body still acclimated to the constant motion of the platform and the ship. I crouched, waiting for the sensation to pass, studying my surroundings. The marina was deserted. Half a dozen boats still moored, gently rising and falling with the tide. A small office building, doors hanging open. A parking lot with 3 vehicles, one with its driver's side door ajar. No movement, no sound except birds and the lapping of waves. I moved cautiously from the dock to the parking lot, checking each vehicle. 2 were locked, keys nowhere in sight. The third, an older model pickup truck, had keys in the ignition. When I turned them, the engine coughed, then died. The battery still had some charge, but not enough to start. And after sitting unused for months, other issues had likely developed. Basic mechanics. I could handle this. Using tools from my pack and parts salvaged from the other vehicles, I spent 2 hours getting the truck operational. Replaced the battery, cleaned fuel lines. By mid-morning, I had it running, rough but reliable enough for what I needed. The truck had half a tank of gas, enough to get me started toward the coordinates, but I'd need to find more along the way. The nearest highway, according to a map in the glove compartment, was Interstate 10, which would take me east toward Mobile. Then I could head north. Before leaving the marina, I took one final look at the Gulf, at the Steadfast anchored offshore. Like the oil platform, the ship had been both prison and sanctuary. Leaving it felt like abandoning safety, but also like taking back control of my own fate. The drive inland was surreal. Roads empty except for abandoned vehicles I had to navigate around. Buildings standing silent, many with doors left open by people fleeing in panic. No signs of active infection, but plenty of evidence it had passed through. Dried bloodstains, bullet holes, barricades that had failed. I maintained a steady pace, stopping only when necessary to clear obstructions or check my map. Always alert, always watching for movement. The few times I spotted infected, they were alone or in pairs, wandering aimlessly. I avoided them easily, having learned patience during my months on the rig. By late afternoon, I had reached the outskirts of Hattiesburg, about 70 miles inland. The increased number of abandoned vehicles on the highway forced me to leave Interstate 49 and take secondary roads. That's when I encountered my first real obstacle. A collapsed bridge over a small river blocked my path east. The detour would add hours to my journey. As I consulted my map for alternatives, I noticed smoke rising from somewhere beyond the tree line to the north. Not the random fires I'd seen in abandoned areas, but a steady column that suggested controlled burning. People. I debated investigating. It could be survivors, potential allies for the journey ahead. It could also be hostile humans. In the chaos of collapse, not all dangers would come from the infected. Or it could be a larger concentration of infected, drawn to something burning. Caution had kept me alive this long. I decided to observe from a distance before making contact. I parked the truck in a concealed location and proceeded on foot, moving silently through the woods as I'd learned to do on the platform. Found a vantage point on a small rise overlooking what turned out to be a fortified farmhouse. The property had been modified for defense. Fences reinforced with scavenged materials, watchpoints at each corner. A cleared perimeter that would make approach difficult without being spotted. Several people moved about the grounds, working, at various tasks. They were armed, but not threatening, just cautious like me. As the sun began to set, I faced a choice. Approach these strangers and risk their reaction, or continue my journey alone toward coordinates that might lead nowhere. The decision I made would be the first of many that would shape my new existence in this changed world. That moment, watching those survivors from the hillside, I realized something fundamental had shifted. On the oil platform, survival had been my only goal. Moment to moment, day to day. Now, seeing others working together, I remembered that humans are social creatures. We build things, we help each other, we create communities. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly consider the future. Not just the next meal or safe place to sleep, but months and years ahead. A life beyond mere survival. And I knew, whatever happened next, I would not go back to the isolation of the platform. Whether with these people or others I might find, I would reconnect with humanity. As darkness fell, I made my approach to the farmhouse, hands open, movements slow and deliberate. Whatever reception awaited me, I was ready. I had survived 90 days alone during the apocalypse. I could survive whatever came next. I approached that farmhouse with my heart pounding, hands raised to show I wasn't a threat. 3 armed men met me at their perimeter fence, rifles aimed at my chest. I identified myself calmly, explained I was traveling to coordinates in the Appalachians, broadcast as a safe zone. For several tense moments, they just stared, as if trying to determine if I was infected somehow. Finally, an older man with a gray beard stepped forward. "When's the last time you saw an infected up close?" he asked. I told him about the oil rig, about Hurricane Eleanor washing them away. He studied my face, then nodded to the others. "He's clean. Bring him in." The farmhouse was home to 14 survivors, 3 families who had consolidated here when their neighborhood fell. They had electricity from solar panels, a well for water, and fields where they grew vegetables. They had created something remarkable, a pocket of normalcy in a collapsed world. They confirmed what I had heard about the Appalachian safe zone. It was real, established by military and civilian survivors who had found the mountains naturally defensible against the infected. The elevation, difficult terrain, and cold winters all worked against the infected, who seemed to struggle in extreme environments. The coordinates I had received were for a place called New Haven, one of several established communities in the mountain range. According to their information, it housed nearly 1,000 survivors and had been operational for months. I stayed with the farmhouse group for 3 days, helping with repairs to their defenses in exchange for food, a place to sleep, and information about the journey ahead. They warned me the roads would become more dangerous as I moved northeast. Cities had largely fallen, but rural communities like theirs had managed to establish footholds. The infected were increasingly concentrated around urban centers, though they occasionally migrated in herds, following sounds or pursuing prey. When I left, they provided me with a hand-drawn map, marking other known survivor outposts along my route, places where I might find help or supplies if needed. They also gave me something I hadn't expected, a revolver with a box of ammunition, a significant gift in this new world where manufacturing had ceased. The next 2 weeks of travel verified everything they had told me. I moved northeast, through Mississippi into Alabama, then up toward Tennessee. The journey was slow, roads often blocked, forcing detours. I traveled mainly at dawn and dusk, avoiding night movement when visibility was poor and daytime when I might be more easily spotted. I encountered the infected frequently, always avoiding rather than engaging. Conserving ammunition became second nature. I observed herds of them moving together, sometimes hundreds strong, and learned to anticipate their paths. When I heard them coming, I would hide my vehicle and myself, sometimes waiting hours for them to pass. The few survivors I met were like those at the farmhouse, cautious, resourceful, willing to trade or share information but quick to defend what was theirs. Most were in small groups of 10 to 20, occupying defensible locations with access to water and food sources. All knew of the Appalachian safe zones, though details varied in their tellings. As I moved farther north into Tennessee, I began hearing more consistent reports about New Haven and other settlements. Military broadcasts occasionally came through on my emergency radio, using coded language but clearly coordinating movements and supply runs. The world wasn't as dead as it had seemed from my isolation on the platform. My truck finally gave out in eastern Tennessee, about 70 miles from the coordinates. The transmission failed completely, likely from pushing too hard on mountain roads. I salvaged what I could carry and continued on foot, following highways initially, then moving to hiking trails as I entered the mountains proper. The Appalachians in autumn were beautiful, the forests a riot of color. The contrast between this natural splendor and the collapsed civilization I'd been traveling through was jarring. Here, it was possible to imagine the infection had never happened, that humanity hadn't nearly destroyed itself. 3 days into my mountain journey, I encountered my first New Haven patrol. 4 men and women in mismatched military and civilian clothing, well-armed and well-equipped. They approached cautiously but not aggressively. When I explained I was headed for the safe zone, they radioed back to their base, then offered to escort me. Their leader, a former Army sergeant named Rivera, explained they regularly patrolled the approaches to their settlement, both to guide in survivors and to eliminate infected that wandered too close. They maintained a perimeter of several miles around New Haven, keeping it relatively clear. As we walked, Rivera asked about my story. I told her about Poseidon's Reach, about surviving alone for 90 days, about Torres and the others, about riding out Hurricane Eleanor, about my journey inland. She listened without interrupting, then simply said, "You'll fit in well with us. We need people who can adapt and survive." New Haven came into view as we crested a ridge on the 4th day of hiking. It was larger than I had expected. A small town nestled in a mountain valley, surrounded by a perimeter wall constructed from a combination of existing structures, vehicles, and scavenged materials. Within the walls, I could see buildings with lights, gardens, even people moving about normally. Not running, not hiding, just living. Processing into New Haven took most of a day. They were careful about who they admitted. Each new arrival was medically examined, interviewed about their experiences, and assessed for what skills they might contribute. My background in mechanical engineering, particularly with power systems and water management, immediately caught their attention. The settlement's leader, a former National Guard colonel named Hargrove, personally welcomed me after my processing was complete. He explained that New Haven had been established in the early days of the outbreak, when military units retreating from overrun coastal areas had connected with civilian survivors in the mountains. They had chosen this location for its defensibility, water sources, and potential for agriculture. They now housed approximately 800 survivors and maintained communication with several other settlements throughout the Appalachians. Some specialized in agriculture, others in manufacturing or medical care. Together, they were rebuilding something like a society. I was assigned housing, a small apartment in what had once been a tourist lodge, given a job maintaining the settlement's power systems. a mix of solar, wind, and hydroelectric generators. Introduced to neighbors, to co-workers, to the rhythms of a community that was learning to function in this new world. The transition was difficult. After months of isolation and constant vigilance, living among so many people was overwhelming. Loud conversations made me flinch. Crowded spaces triggered panic. I would wake in the night convinced I heard infected outside my door. The settlement's psychologist, formerly a college professor, told me I was experiencing post-traumatic stress, that it would take time to readjust. She was right. Gradually, day by day, I began to integrate. Working with my hands helped, solving practical problems, feeling useful. Making connections with others who had survived similar experiences helped more. Everyone in New Haven carried trauma. Everyone had lost someone. We recognized the shadows in each other's eyes. 3 weeks after my arrival, while working on a hydroelectric generator at the mountain stream that provided much of the settlement's power, I overheard a radio conversation that changed everything again. One of the patrol units was reporting contact with another survivor, one who claimed to have come from an oil platform in the Gulf. I immediately sought out Colonel Hargrove, told him about Poseidon's Reach, about the other drilling platforms in our network. Explained that if one survivor had made it from another rig, there might be more out there. People like me isolated, thinking they might be the last humans alive. Hargrove listened intently, then showed me to their communication center, a room filled with repurposed and patched-together radio equipment. The operator played back the recorded transmission. The voice was unfamiliar, but the story was eerily similar to mine. Another oil worker, survived on a different platform, made it to shore after the hurricane, had been working his way inland ever since. The patrol had brought him in. He was in medical now, being checked over like all new arrivals. I went immediately, found him sitting on an examination table while a doctor cleaned and bandaged cuts on his forearms. He looked up as I entered, confusion crossing his face. "Jeffries," he said. "Waylon Jeffries from Poseidon's Reach?" It was Miller, an electrical specialist from our sister platform 40 miles east of us. We had met at training sessions, spoken occasionally over radio before the outbreak. Never close friends, but connected by our shared profession. Now impossibly, reconnected in this mountain refuge hundreds of miles from where we had both nearly died. His platform, Poseidon's sister, had suffered the same fate as ours. Infection, survivors holding out, eventual isolation. He had been alone for weeks before Hurricane Eleanor. Like me, he had found the storm's destruction provided an opportunity for escape, had made his way to shore, then inland, following rumors of safe havens. How many more could be out there? I asked Hargrove. Later that day, as we reviewed maps of the Gulf drilling operations. Dozens of platforms, each potentially housing survivors who, like us, had the skills in isolation to survive the initial outbreak. People with technical knowledge that would be invaluable to rebuilding efforts. The colonel was pragmatic but supportive. New Haven's resources were limited. They couldn't mount a full-scale Gulf rescue operation, but they could authorize a small expedition, properly equipped to investigate the platforms closest to shore. If we found more survivors, we would bring them back. If we found usable resources, fuel, tools, medical supplies, even better. I volunteered immediately to lead the expedition. Miller joined as well, along with Rivera from the patrol unit and 2 others with naval experience. We spent 2 weeks planning, gathering equipment, studying maps and weather patterns. The journey would be dangerous. Traveling through infected territory, navigating coastal waters, boarding potentially unstable platforms. The night before our departure, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from a strange sense of completion. 3 months ago, Torres had made me promise to reach shore, to find his family if possible. I had kept the first part of that promise. Now, by returning to rescue others who might still be stranded, I felt I was honoring the second part as well. Our expedition left at dawn, 5 of us in 2 vehicles loaded with supplies, weapons, communications equipment. The journey back, To the coast would take approximately 10 days if we encountered no major obstacles. From there, we would need to secure a suitable boat, then plot a course to check the most promising platforms. As we drove through New Haven's gates, waved off by Colonel Hargrove and others who had gathered to see us off, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the outbreak. Purpose. Not just survival, not just making it through another day, but working towards something larger than myself. The road ahead would be difficult. Many of the platforms might be empty or worse than empty. The infected still controlled much of the territory between the mountains and the coast. Weather, mechanical failures, and 1,000 other dangers threatened our mission. But I had survived 90 days alone on a dying oil platform during the zombie apocalypse. I had navigated a hurricane that tore my world apart. I had crossed hundreds of miles of hostile territory to find this new beginning. Whatever challenges awaited us, I would face them with the same determination, the same adaptability that had kept me alive when everything tried to kill me. Yesterday, our team picked up a transmission from another oil platform in the Gulf. A man's voice breaking through static, asking if anyone could hear him. "We're sending a rescue team tomorrow." I volunteered to lead it. After all, if anyone knows how to survive out there, it's me. And I made a promise to go back to the shore. I never promised which shore. If you're watching this and still out there alone, don't give up. Keep moving. Stay smart. We're organizing, rebuilding, connecting. This isn't the end of our story, it's just a different chapter. And we're coming to find you, I promise.